A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, Herman, I was looking at some high-definition footage from the latest interception over the Galilee last night. It was one of those clear nights where you could see the trail of the Tamir interceptor perfectly. It is truly a marvel of engineering. You see that tiny speck of light, the interceptor, making these micro-adjustments in real time at supersonic speeds to hit a moving target that is basically a flying garage door filled with explosives. It is high-level physics and software engineering happening in a fraction of a second. It makes you feel like we are living in the future, especially with the ion beam laser systems now being integrated into the stack.
It is incredible, Corn, truly. When you see a laser system tracking a mortar shell at the speed of light, you realize the sheer amount of computational power and algorithmic sophistication required. But then I spent the morning reading the latest reports from the Ministry of Education on our secondary education system, and it is like looking at two different countries, or perhaps two different centuries. You have the Iron Dome and the Arrow 3, which are arguably the most sophisticated missile defense systems in the world, and then you have our average classroom in a town like Beit Shemesh, Rahat, or Kiryat Gat, where the math scores are, frankly, underwhelming. It is a massive, jarring disconnect between the penthouse of our innovation and the foundation of our schools.
It is the great Israeli paradox. How do we produce the world's best defense tech while our national PISA scores, the Program for International Student Assessment, consistently trail the average for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development? We are talking about 15-year-olds who, on average, are ranking below their peers in Estonia, Poland, and Vietnam in math and science literacy. Our friend and housemate Daniel was actually asking us about this very thing the other day. He sent over a prompt looking for us to dig into this structural disconnect between our elite research output and the struggling secondary schools. He wanted to know if the system is broken, or if it is working exactly as it was designed, as a filter rather than a funnel.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been chomping at the bit to talk about this, because if you just look at the headlines in March of 2026, you would think Israel is a nation of pure geniuses. We still have more startups per capita than anywhere else. We have the Technion and the Weizmann Institute of Science, which are basically the Ivy League of the Middle East, producing Nobel laureates and world-class patents. But if you look at the baseline, the foundation that every citizen stands on, it is looking incredibly shaky. Today, we are going to look at how the military-industrial complex basically acts as a massive, high-pressure bridge for talent because the school system itself is often failing to build that bridge. We are going to ask, can a country survive when its defense is built on a talent pool that is shrinking relative to the rest of the population?
Right, and it is not just a matter of, the schools are bad. It is much more complex than that. We are talking about a two-tier system that seems almost designed to filter for a tiny elite rather than elevating the entire population. We have discussed the demographic shifts before, especially back in episode 1257 when we talked about the Hardy community and military service. But today is about the technical pipeline. Why is there such a gap between the kid sitting in a crowded high school classroom with 40 other students and the engineer at Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, or Elbit? How does a student go from a mediocre middle school to designing algorithms for autonomous drones?
That is the right question. And I think we need to start by being honest about what those international test scores actually show. When people see that Israel is below the average for the developed world in math and science literacy, they often assume it is because the curriculum is poor across the board. But the reality is that Israel has one of the highest standard deviations in the world. We don't have a normal bell curve, we have a bimodal distribution. We have a tale of incredibly high achievers who are off the charts, but we have a very long, heavy tail of students who are barely meeting the basic requirements of the 21st century.
So it is not a unified national experience. It is a bifurcated reality. You have the secular and national religious elite tracks in cities like Herzliya, Ra'anana, and parts of Jerusalem that are doing exceptionally well. These kids are often in specialized cyber tracks or advanced physics programs. And then you have the Haredi and Arab sectors where the core curriculum, especially in math and English, is often minimal, underfunded, or in some cases entirely absent. When you average those together, the national score drops, even if our top 5% are arguably the best in the world.
And that top 5% is what powers the startup nation. But here is the catch, Corn. Even for those top students, the high school system itself often is not enough. Most of these kids are getting their real world-class technical education not in the classroom, but in the military, specifically in units like 8200, Unit 81, or the Talpiot program. The secondary school system provides the raw material, but the military provides the actual refining process.
That is a provocative way to frame it. You are saying the military is not just a consumer of talent, but the primary producer of it. It is acting as a sort of shadow university, or a national vocational school for the elite that fixes the gaps left by the Ministry of Education. If the high school fails to teach you how to think critically about a complex system, the IDF will force you to learn it, because lives are on the line.
That is exactly what it is. Think about the Talpiot program. Every year they take fewer than 50 recruits. Think about that, 50 kids out of an entire cohort of nearly 100,000. These are the absolute smartest, most resilient kids in the country. They go through 3 years of intensive academic study in physics, mathematics, and computer science at Hebrew University while simultaneously doing their military training. They don't just learn the theory, they are tasked with solving actual high-stakes defense problems that the country is facing right now. By the time they are 21, they have a degree, they have leadership experience, and they have a network that is more valuable than any Harvard MBA. That is a level of elite training that a standard university, let alone a high school, just cannot replicate because it lacks the pressure cooker environment.
But that creates a massive bottleneck, doesn't it? If the secret sauce of Israeli tech is these elite units, what happens to the other 99% of the kids who do not get into Talpiot or 8200? If the secondary system is mediocre, and the military only fixes the elite, aren't we leaving a huge amount of human capital on the table? We are essentially saying to the kid in the periphery, if you aren't a genius who can overcome a subpar school system, you don't get to be part of the high-tech miracle.
We are. And that is the lost generation problem. If you are a smart kid in a peripheral town like Kiryat Shmona or Sderot, and your high school is overcrowded, lacks advanced physics labs, and has a shortage of qualified teachers, your chances of hitting that elite military track are statistically much lower. You might be brilliant, but if you do not have the baseline training to pass the entrance exams for the tech units, which are incredibly rigorous, the bridge is out. You end up in a standard infantry unit, which is honorable and necessary for our survival, but it means your technical potential is never developed. The state loses an engineer, and the individual loses a career path.
It feels like a very high-stakes version of filtering versus nurturing. A nurture model, like what you might see in Finland or Singapore, would say, let's raise the floor for everyone so we have a massive, deep pool of talent. The Israeli model seems to be a filter model. Let's create the most intense filters possible to find the absolute best, and then pour all our resources into them. It worked for building an iron dome in the short term, but does it work for a sustainable 21st century economy when the complexity of technology is increasing exponentially?
Well, look at the numbers from 2025. Israel still has the highest percentage of research and development spending relative to gross domestic product in the world, around 5.4%. Most of that is driven by the private sector and the defense industry. But the pipeline is thinning. The demand for engineers in the civilian sector is skyrocketing. We are talking about a shortage of over 20,000 engineers, but the supply is constrained by this narrow military academic funnel. If we do not broaden that bridge, the paradox eventually becomes a systemic failure. You can't run a global tech hub on the output of 50 Talpiot graduates and a few hundred 8200 alumni a year.
I want to dig deeper into that bridge concept. If we look at the secondary schools, the Bagrut or matriculation exams are the big hurdle. There is a huge emphasis on whether a student takes the 5 units level of math versus the 3 or 4 units. In the last decade, there has been a massive government push to get more kids into the 5-unit track. Has that actually worked, or has it just watered down the standards?
It has increased the numbers on paper, but it has highlighted the resource gap. To teach 5-unit math effectively, you need teachers who actually understand the material deeply, people who could easily be making 6 figures in the private sector. And right now, we have a massive shortage of qualified STEM teachers. Why would a brilliant mathematician teach high school for a government salary when they can make 4 times as much at a cybersecurity startup in Tel Aviv? This is the internal brain drain. The talent is being sucked out of the foundation and into the penthouse.
That is a classic tragedy of the commons situation. The tech companies need the teachers to produce the students, but they hire the potential teachers away, ensuring the next generation of students will be less prepared. And that brings up the other side of the paradox Daniel mentioned, the tertiary system, the Technion, the Weizmann Institute, Hebrew University. These places are world-class. How do they maintain that level of excellence if the secondary system feeding into them is struggling?
They do it through extreme selectivity and by leaning on the military background of their students. An Israeli freshman at the Technion is not like an 18-year-old freshman in the United States. They are 21 or 22. They have spent 3 years in the army. They have a level of maturity, discipline, and often practical technical experience that makes them much more capable of handling a grueling engineering curriculum. The universities are basically getting pre-processed students. The military has already done the heavy lifting of teaching them how to work under pressure and solve problems. But again, this only applies to those who made it through the military filter.
So the military is the buffer. It takes the raw material from the high schools, refines it, and then hands it off to the universities. But this is where the geopolitical reality of 2026 comes in. We are seeing a shift where the military needs more bodies in combat roles due to the multi-front threats we are facing. If you pull more of those smart kids into traditional combat roles because the security situation demands it, do you starve the tech pipeline? Or if you keep them in tech, do you weaken the front lines?
That is the nightmare scenario for the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Defense. There is a constant tug of war. And as we discussed in episode 1247 regarding the Aliyah paradox, we are not seeing enough highly skilled immigration to fill the gap. We have to grow our own talent. But when your growth sectors, the Haredi and Arab communities, are the ones with the least access to this pipeline, you are essentially trying to run a marathon on one leg.
Let's talk about the brain drain to Silicon Valley. This is a huge concern. We spend all this money, the military spends all this time training these elite individuals, and then they get a job offer from Google, Meta, or an AI lab in California, and they leave. Is that inevitable for a small country?
It is a rational economic choice for the individual, but a disaster for the state. If you are a Talpiot graduate, you are basically a product that the state has invested millions of shekels in. When you move to Palo Alto, that investment is essentially a gift to the American economy. Now, some people call it brain circulation because these people often stay connected to Israel, they invest back home, or they eventually return to start companies. But the net loss of talent is real. In 2024 and 2025, we saw an uptick in relocation, inquiries from high-tech professionals, partly due to the political instability and the rising cost of living here.
And it is not just about the money, is it? It is about the research infrastructure. If you are doing cutting-edge AI or quantum computing research, the resources in Silicon Valley or at MIT are just on another level. Even the Technion has a hard time competing with the sheer scale of the American tech giants.
And this is where policy comes in. If we want to keep our best and brightest, we cannot just rely on Zionism or a sense of duty. We have to make it professionally and economically viable to stay. We talked about this a bit in episode 474 when we looked at the price of national autonomy. Can a small nation truly go it alone in the tech race? The answer is only if it can keep its talent. And to keep talent, you need a society that functions well at all levels, not just in the R&D labs.
That is the question, and it feels like the current model is reaching its limit. We have been relying on this elite silo model for decades. It worked when the population was smaller and the tech sector was a smaller part of the economy. But now, tech is the engine of the entire country. You cannot run a whole country's engine on a pipeline that only accepts 50 kids a year into its top program.
You really can't. And that brings us to the demographic issue. We cannot ignore the fact that the fastest growing sectors of our population are the ones currently least involved in this tech pipeline, the Haredi and Arab sectors. If we do not find a way to integrate them into high-level STEM education, the average national performance will continue to decline, and the burden on the shrinking secular elite core will become unsustainable. We are already seeing the brain drain being driven by the feeling that the burden of taxes and military service is not being shared equally.
It is a math problem, essentially. If the sector that produces the engineers is shrinking as a percentage of the total, and the sectors that do not are growing, the math eventually breaks the country. We saw this in the discussion about the Haredi paradox in episode 1257. The lack of core curriculum in Haredi schools is not just a cultural issue, it is a national security issue, because it limits the pool of people who can maintain the Iron Dome in 20 years. If you can't do calculus, you can't maintain a missile defense system. It is that simple.
And it is not just about the Haredi schools. The Arab sector has its own challenges. There is a lot of talent there, but the schools in Arab towns are often underfunded and have lower standards for STEM. If we could tap into that talent pool, we could potentially double our technical workforce, but that requires a massive structural change in how we view education. It requires moving away from the filter model and toward a nurture model that spans the entire country.
So what does that look like? If you are a policymaker in the Knesset today, looking at the data from 2026, what are the levers you pull? Do you demilitarize the tech pipeline? Do you try to create Talpiot-style programs in civilian high schools?
That is one approach. There is a program called Magshimim, which is a national cyber education program for gifted students in the periphery. It is basically an after-school program that mimics the intensity of military training. It has been very successful, but it is still an add-on to the existing school system. It doesn't fix the fact that the classroom itself is often a place where students are just marking time. We need to move toward a model where the elite training is the standard for the top 20%, not just the top 0.1%.
It is a patch, not a fix. It is like trying to fix a leaky bucket by putting a smaller, better bucket inside it. You are still losing most of the water.
Precisely. We need a massive investment in teacher training. We need to find a way to make teaching a prestigious, well-paid career. Maybe it is service for tuition bonds. Imagine if the state paid for your entire doctorate in physics if you agreed to teach in a peripheral high school for 5 years afterward. This would create a civilian service, track, that is just as prestigious as the elite military units. It would bring that high-level expertise directly into the classrooms of Stero or Rahat.
That is an interesting idea. It is modeled after the military service, but for education. You give the state 5 years of your talent in exchange for your education. It creates a sense of mission, and it helps with the brain drain too. If you are rooted in a community for 5 years, building relationships, seeing the impact you have on students, you are much more likely to stay in the country than if you just finish your degree and look for the highest bidder in Palo Alto.
And you have to change the tax structure. Right now, we tax labor very heavily. If we want to encourage people to stay in research and education, we need to create tax incentives for those specific roles. We need to make it so that a senior researcher at the Weizmann Institute can live a life that is comparable to a senior developer at Google. Not identical, but comparable.
Let's talk about the Silicon Valley comparison. Singapore is often brought up as a comparison for Israel. They are a small, highly developed nation with a massive focus on education. But their model is very different. It is much more top-down, government-led. They have these government scholarship models where they send their best students to the best universities in the world on the condition that they return and work for the government for a set number of years.
Singapore's model is about nurturing from the cradle. They have a very high baseline. Their PISA scores are consistently at the top, but they often lack the Israeli spark. that culture of chutzpah and improvisation that comes from the military experience. The Israeli model is messy, it is inefficient at the bottom, but it produces these incredible outliers at the top. The challenge is that in the modern world, you need both. You need the outliers to invent the Iron Dome, but you need a high-functioning baseline to manufacture it, maintain it, and run the economy that pays for it. If the baseline falls too low, the outliers can't save you.
It is the guns versus butter debate we looked at in episode 548. The high price of security is not just the budget, it is the human capital. If all our best minds are focused on guns, even very sophisticated electronic ones, who is focusing on the butter, the healthcare systems, the urban planning, the primary education? If the education system only serves the survival mechanism, the rest of the society starts to atrophy.
That is the core of the paradox. We have built a system that is incredibly good at one thing, survival. And survival in 2026 requires high-tech defense. But a nation cannot live on survival alone. It needs a thriving, broad-based society. I'm looking at the Education 2030 reform proposals currently being debated. They are talking about giving schools more autonomy, reducing the number of matriculation exams, and focusing more on skills rather than memorization.
Does that move the needle? Or is it just another bureaucratic reshuffle?
It is a step in the right direction, but it is controversial. The traditionalists argue that if you reduce the number of exams, you lower the standards. But the reformers argue that the current exams are just testing the ability to memorize, not the ability to think critically. If you look at what makes an 8200 recruit successful, it is not that they memorized a textbook. It is that they know how to take a problem they have never seen before and find a creative solution. That is the hacker mindset.
And you were saying that is what the schools should be teaching. We should be teaching the hacker mindset to everyone, not just the kids who are destined for the elite units. Because that mindset is just as valuable in medicine, in law, in business, and in social work. If we could bridge the gap between the high-pressure, creative problem-solving of the military and the rote learning of the classroom, we would solve the paradox.
But how do you scale that? It is easy to do with 50 kids in Talpiot. How do you do it with 2 million kids in the public school system? You start by trusting the teachers more and the central bureaucracy less. Give local principals the budget and the freedom to hire the best people and experiment with different teaching methods. We have seen that when schools in the periphery are given the resources and the autonomy, they can produce amazing results. But the current system is very centralized, very rigid. It is a 1950s factory model trying to run a 21st century tech hub.
It is interesting that the military, which is the most hierarchical organization by definition, is actually more decentralized in its tech units than the Ministry of Education is. In a unit like 8200, a 20-year-old sergeant can tell a colonel they are wrong if the data supports it. That kind of flat hierarchy is what drives innovation. But in the school system, it is all about seniority and following the curriculum handed down from Jerusalem.
That is a profound observation, Korn. The military has learned that in the digital age, hierarchy is a bottleneck. The education system hasn't learned that yet. If we want to fix the pipeline, we need to demilitarize the tech training in the sense of making it available to everyone, but militarize the school system in the sense of adopting that flat, meritocratic, problem-solving culture. We need to stop viewing the classroom as a place where information is delivered and start viewing it as a place where problems are solved.
So, looking ahead, what happens if we don't fix this? If we are sitting here in 10 years, in 2036, and the paradox is still there? Can the Iron Dome survive if the talent pipeline dries up? Can the economy sustain the defense budget if the high-tech sector stops growing?
The short answer is no. Systems like the Iron Dome or the new iron beam laser systems are not set-it-and-forget-it technologies. They require constant updates, constant tinkering to stay ahead of the enemy's own technological advancements. If we lose that top 5% of elite talent to the US, or if that 5% shrinks because the foundation is too weak, our qualitative military edge disappears. And in this neighborhood, when you lose your edge, you lose everything. The education paradox isn't just a social issue, it is an existential threat.
That is the sobering reality. We have to view the classroom as being just as vital to national security as the cockpit of an F-35. The teacher in a middle school in Rahat is, in a very real sense, a frontline defender of the state.
And for our listeners who are wondering what they can do, I think the first step is awareness. We need to stop patting ourselves on the back for being the startup nation and start looking at the PISA scores with the same urgency we look at a radar screen. Support the programs like Maximum that are working to bridge the gap in the periphery. Push for reforms that give schools more autonomy. And if you are in the tech sector, consider how you can give back to the foundation, whether it is through mentoring, teaching, or advocating for better STEM funding.
It is about brain circulation within the country, not just internationally. Moving that expertise from the high-tech hubs back into the schools. We need to make the bridge a two-way street.
Precisely. And we should also look at the nevertheless immigration plan we discussed in episode 1245. We need to make sure that when Jews from around the world look at Israel, they see a place where their children will get a world-class education, not just a place that is safe from anti-Semitism. The brain drain is a two-way street, and we need to make sure the inflow of talent is as strong as the outflow.
This has been a fascinating deep dive, Herman. It is easy to take our tech success for granted, but when you look at the mechanics of the pipeline, you realize how fragile it actually is. It is built on these elite silos and a military bridge that is under a lot of strain. We are essentially running a world-class defense system on a foundation that is showing significant cracks.
It really is. And I think the takeaway is that the Israeli miracle isn't a natural resource like oil or gas. It is a human resource that has to be nurtured, expanded, and protected. We can't keep relying on a tiny elite to carry the whole country. We have to raise the floor. If we don't, the ceiling will eventually come crashing down.
Well, if you found this discussion as eye-opening as I did, we would really appreciate it if you could leave a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation about these structural issues.
It really does. And if you want to dig deeper into these topics, check out our archive at myweirdprompts.com. You can find all our past episodes there, including the ones we mentioned today, like episode 1257 on the Haredi paradox and episode 1245 on the global diaspora. There is a lot of connected tissue between these issues.
Definitely. You can also join our Telegram channel. Just search for My Weird Prompts to get a notification whenever a new episode drops. We are always exploring these kinds of complex, structural questions that define our world in 2026.
Thanks to Daniel for the prompt that got us started on this today. It is a topic that hits close to home for anyone living in Israel and seeing these two worlds, the high-tech labs and the struggling schools side by side every day.
Until next time, I'm Corn Poppleberry.
And I'm Herman Poppleberry. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Stay curious, everyone.
And keep asking those weird questions. Bye for now.
Take care.
One more thing before we go, Corn. I was thinking about that Singapore model again. You know, they have almost no natural resources, just like us. Their only resource is their people.
Right. And they treat their people like a strategic reserve. Every child is an investment.
We have the innovation part down, but we are missing that strategic investment in everyone part. If we could combine the two, the Israeli chutzpah and the Singaporean baseline, we would be unstoppable.
It is about moving from survival mode to thriving mode. And that starts in the classroom, not the command center.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, now we are really going.
See you next time.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.